Paris glittered that night. The city seemed to hum with anticipation, its lights trembling across the Seine like scattered notes of a song too beautiful to end. Inside the Philharmonic Hall, chandeliers shimmered like constellations suspended in crystal, and the air vibrated with the rustle of silk, the low murmur of champagne laughter, and the quiet arrogance of power. It was the kind of night where every smile was rehearsed, every compliment measured, every secret neatly pressed beneath couture and charm. And at the center of it all stood Alexander Pierce, conductor, prodigy, golden son of American high society. The orchestra waited for his cue, their bows poised, their breath held. His hands rose, graceful and certain, commanding silence before the first swell of music. To the audience, he was perfection embodied, the genius whose career had redefined the symphonic arts in Paris. But perfection is often the most fragile mask. From the shadows of the marble foyer, Evelyn Monroe watched him. Her pulse kept time with the rhythm of the violins she had once inspired. For a moment, she almost didn't move, her reflection flickering in the mirrored walls like a ghost, and perhaps, in this city, that was what she had become. He hadn't seen her yet. No one had. The ushers, mistaking her composure for belonging, had opened the velvet ropes without question. And so she stood there, unseen, listening to the man who had once promised her a world built on honesty, a world he'd instead constructed on omission. The hall was breathtaking, a cathedral for music, gilded in centuries of devotion. But beneath the gold leaf and grandeur, Evelyn felt the familiar chill of exclusion. Every portrait on the walls was pale. Every name engraved into the marble was foreign to hers. Even now, she could hear Alexander's voice from years ago, smooth and practiced. "Europe is different, darling. Let them get to know the music before they get to know us." The U.S. had disappeared long ago. The strings soared, and applause thundered as Alexander bowed deeply. Cameras flashed, catching his every angle, his effortless grace. He smiled, that charming, immaculate smile the world adored, and took the hand of a young violinist beside him, Clara Voss, the newest muse, the public face of his brilliance. Their fingers brushed, lingered, a performance within a performance. The audience cooed, charmed by the romance of genius and inspiration. Evelyn stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. A ripple moved through the crowd, first curiosity, then silence. It wasn't her gown that caught their attention, though it shimmered like a midnight sea. It was her presence. There was something magnetic in the calm of a woman who had come to reclaim the truth. The kind of calm that follows storms, that warns of more to come. Alexander's smile faltered. His eyes widened in disbelief, then panic. For a man who had mastered every tempo, he suddenly seemed incapable of finding the rhythm of the moment. "Bonsoir, maestro," Evelyn said softly, her voice carrying easily through the stunned hush. "It's been a long time." Her tone was not accusatory, nor desperate. It was symphonic, measured, composed, resonant with quiet authority. Around them, whispers bloomed like wildfire. Who is she? How does she know him? Why does he look like that? Alexander stepped down from the podium, his polished confidence cracking at the edges. "Evelyn," he breathed, barely audible. "What are you doing here?" "Listening," she replied, "to the same music you used to tell me was ours." The tension that filled the hall was electric, almost sacred, the unmasking of artifice before an audience trained to applaud illusion. Evelyn's eyes moved across the crowd, taking in the glittering faces that had never known her name, though she had been the silent architect of much of Alexander's success. She smiled faintly. "You never told them, did you?" Alexander froze. The question was soft, but it landed like thunder. In that instant, the golden veneer of his world cracked, revealing the smallness beneath its shine. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but expectant. It was as if Paris itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what this forgotten woman would do next. Evelyn turned slightly, her gaze lifting toward the audience. "It's strange," she said, her voice calm yet edged with poetry. "How easily the world celebrates half a truth, how quickly it forgets the other half that gave it life." And then she walked away, leaving a room full of gasps and speculation, her heels echoing like punctuation at the end of a long, dishonest symphony. Behind her, Alexander's orchestra began to falter, bows trembling, notes unraveling in dissonant confusion. Outside, the night air was cold, fragrant with rain. Paris glowed, oblivious, eternal, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred inside the Philharmonic Hall. But for Evelyn Monroe, the city had shifted. Tonight she had taken the first step toward reclaiming her voice. The first note of her own resurrection had been struck. And perhaps, as you stand in your own quiet moments of truth, watching someone else conduct the story you helped compose, you'll remember her, the woman who refused to be erased. If her story moves you, share your thoughts below. Tell the world what part of yourself you're ready to reclaim. And if you want to follow her journey, and stories like hers, stay close. The next movement is about to begin. Years before Paris and the glittering deceit of the Philharmonic, there had been a winter night in New York, and the sound of snow against glass. Evelyn Monroe remembered it clearly, the hush before destiny speaks. She'd been rehearsing with a small ensemble at Lincoln Center, composing between teaching and surviving, when a stranger lingered after her performance. He was tall, graceful in that effortless way certain men are when they've never had to fight for space. Alexander Pierce introduced himself as a visiting conductor from Boston, though his accent carried the soft polish of privilege. His eyes, a pale, disarming blue, met hers with the kind of curiosity that feels like flattery and prophecy at once. "I've never heard anyone make silence sound so alive," he said. She smiled politely. "Silence is the only part of music you can't fake." He laughed. Not the hollow kind used at cocktail parties, but something genuine, almost boyish. They spoke for hours that night, long after the theater emptied. He told her about his ambition to bring modern American composers into the European tradition. She spoke of her dream to write symphonies that sounded like the city, its pulse, its chaos, its ache. By the time dawn touched the Hudson, their conversation had already turned into something else. A duet neither of them could have written alone. In those early months, everything between them felt like improvisation, a jazz rhythm too new for rules. He'd listen to her play and close his eyes as if memorizing her soul through sound. She'd watch him conduct and imagine she was the melody he followed. When he asked her to marry him a year later, it didn't feel sudden. It felt inevitable. They were married quietly in Brooklyn, a private ceremony, simple and radiant. Her mother cried softly through the vows. His family sent polite regrets from afar. He'd promised they would visit soon, that time would smooth over any reservations. "They'll love you once they know you," he'd said, brushing his thumb along her cheek. "They just need to see what I see." But time, Evelyn would learn, doesn't always soften prejudice. Sometimes it simply teaches it to hide behind better manners. Their first months together were a composition of contrasts, laughter threaded with disquiet. Alexander, who once seemed fearless, began to flinch at public scrutiny. At dinner parties, he introduced her as "my colleague from New York." When she corrected him, his smile never faltered. It simply tightened. "Paris is different," he said one night, when she asked why she wasn't invited to a reception in his honor. "People talk. They love to build stories from shadows. I just want to protect what we have." Protect it was such a tender word, almost noble. She wanted to believe him, and for a while, she did. When he accepted the position with the Paris Philharmonic, she packed their lives into crates of sheet music and dreams. She told herself that love could outplay anything, culture, class, race, that genius would shield them, that the music they made together would drown out the whispers of a world unready for them. Paris, at first, was a miracle. The apartment near the Rue Saint-Honoré, the balcony overlooking the river, the scent of warm bread and rain-soaked cobblestones. She would wake to the sound of him practicing at the piano, shirt sleeves rolled, humming the melodies she'd written the night before. Those were the mornings she felt infinite, like they were building something eternal. But eternity is fragile when built on omission. It began subtly. The first rehearsal she wasn't invited to attend. The first interview where he referred to himself in the singular. I, not we. The first time a journalist asked if he was married and he hesitated. He told her afterward that it was easier that way, that mentioning her would only invite questions she didn't need to answer. Questions like why her? Still, she tried to be understanding, tried to remember that love demanded patience, that history didn't change overnight. But the patience she offered turned into permission, and permission, unguarded, becomes surrender. By the second year, she'd begun composing less and waiting more, waiting for him to come home, waiting for her name to be spoken aloud, waiting for the promise that he would finally introduce her to his world. Instead, the silence grew louder, swallowing everything they'd once been. Evelyn's music changed too. Her melodies no longer soared. They circled, searching for escape. Even her students noticed the shift. "Your compositions sound like something is missing," one of them said gently. She smiled and told them it was intentional, a study in restraint. But she knew better. It wasn't restraint. It was erasure, written in 4/4 time. One evening, she found him sitting at the piano, playing a new piece she didn't recognize. "It's lovely," she said, resting her hand on his shoulder. "Whose is it?" He hesitated, then answered too quickly. "Just something I've been working on." But she knew that melody. It was hers, a fragment she'd composed months ago, one she'd played for him on a rainy afternoon. He'd written over it, polished it, made it his own. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. How do you accuse someone of stealing the invisible? How do you prove that what they've taken is your soul? That night, Evelyn sat by the window as Paris glittered below, each light a reminder of how far she was from the woman she used to be. The city was magnificent and merciless. Every note she'd written, every dream she'd carried across the ocean, felt buried beneath its elegant indifference. Alexander came to her then, kissed the top of her head, whispered, "I love you," and went to bed. She stayed by the window until morning, listening to the echo of his words, hollow and practiced. Outside, the street musicians were tuning their violins for another day, and for the first time, Evelyn understood the true cruelty of silence. It doesn't arrive all at once. It gathers slowly, softly, until it feels like love. There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being unseen in the presence of someone who once looked at you as if you were the only light in the room. Evelyn Monroe learned that loneliness slowly, like a melody she could not stop hearing. In the beginning, she still believed the distance between them was temporary. Paris, she told herself, was a complicated city, a maze of etiquette and expectation. Perhaps Alexander was only adjusting to his new post, to the endless scrutiny of patrons and critics. He had promised that when the season settled, when the concerts became routine, they would return to the way things were. But routine never came. Instead, there were layers of small omissions, subtle, polished, perfectly excused. The first came when the Philharmonic's Winter Gala was announced. Evelyn received no invitation, though her name had once appeared beside his on programs and press releases. When she asked about it, Alexander smiled with the same rehearsed gentleness he used on donors. "It's formal, darling. You'd be bored. These people are exhausting. Endless talk of money and lineage." She wanted to believe him. But that night, while scrolling through society pages, she saw a photograph of him beneath a glittering chandelier, tuxedoed, flawless, his hand resting lightly on Clara Voss's bare shoulder. Beneath the caption, one phrase glowed in silver ink: "The maestro and his muse." When he returned home past midnight, smelling faintly of champagne, Evelyn said nothing. Silence had begun to feel like safety, safer than knowing, safer than the humiliation of asking. Yet even silence leaves traces. The next morning she found a cufflink under the sofa, engraved with the letter C. Not his, not hers. She held it in her palm until the metal warmed against her skin, then placed it gently on the piano, beside the sheet music of the duet they'd once written together. The apartment itself seemed to conspire with her disappearance. The walls, once alive with her laughter, became galleries of his accomplishments. Framed reviews, glossy magazine covers, portraits gifted by patrons. Her own work remained tucked away in folders, her compositions stacked like forgotten letters in a drawer that no one opened anymore. Sometimes, when Alexander was away, she would wander through the rooms, trying to find evidence that she still belonged. Her coffee cup on the kitchen counter, her scarf on the chair by the window. Little things that proved she existed within this space. But each time she looked, there was less. Fewer signs of her. More of him. The city reflected her erasure in cruel symmetry. When she walked the boulevards, people stared with polite confusion, as if trying to remember where she fit. Waiters addressed her in English, slowly, carefully, assuming she was a tourist. At receptions, she lingered at the edges of conversations that never included her. Even the music of Paris seemed to fade. Its street songs, its laughter, its warmth, until all she could hear was the hollow rhythm of her own heartbeat. At night, she'd sit at her piano, pressing single keys in the dark. One note, then another. Small, aching sounds, like footsteps retreating down a long corridor. Music had always been her language, but now it betrayed her. Every phrase turned to elegy, every harmony dissolving into dissonance. She composed entire movements in her head that she never wrote down, afraid that if she gave them shape, she'd have to face what they were truly about. Sometimes Alexander would return home late and find her there. He would lean in the doorway, smiling softly, as if she were a delicate creature he couldn't quite understand. "You still up?" he'd ask. She'd nod, her hands hovering over the keys. "Just thinking." About what? About whether silence is the absence of sound, or the presence of too much unspoken truth. He would laugh, lightly, nervously, and change the subject. There were moments, brief and treacherous, when she still glimpsed the man she loved, the one who'd stayed up all night talking about Coltrane and Mahler, who once told her that her mind was a symphony no one else could conduct. Those moments hurt the most, because they reminded her that love, too, can become a ghost, haunting the places where it once lived freely. By spring, her name had been erased entirely from the Philharmonic circle. No one asked about her. When she attended one of Alexander's concerts, unannounced, the ushers seated her in the balcony, far from the donors and critics, far from him. From that distance, she could watch him clearly without being seen. He looked radiant, commanding, as if he belonged to every person in that hall except her. As the orchestra swelled beneath his baton, Evelyn felt something inside her fracture quietly, like glass under pressure. The realization arrived not in words, but in sensation. A stillness too absolute, a silence too clean. She understood then that love could be polished into disappearance, that devotion, when one-sided, becomes invisible even to the one who gives it. After the concert, she lingered as the hall emptied, watching the stagehands clear away music stands and chairs. One of them accidentally left a score on the podium, Alexander's notes scribbled across the margins. She recognized a motif on the last page. It was hers, a melody she'd written years ago, one that had once belonged to them both. She folded the paper carefully, slipped it into her coat pocket, and walked out into the Paris night. The air was damp, the moon veiled in mist. Somewhere in the distance, a saxophonist played on a bridge, the sound thin and beautiful, struggling against the wind. Evelyn paused, listening. The music wavered, but it didn't stop. Neither did she. She kept walking, through the echoing boulevards, through her own growing clarity. She had not vanished, not yet. But she was beginning to understand how easily a woman could disappear in someone else's masterpiece. Morning light crept softly through the curtains, brushing pale gold across the floorboards. Paris, in its early hush, was beautiful in ways that almost felt cruel. Too composed, too eternal, untouched by the small collapses of human hearts. Evelyn sat at her piano, a porcelain cup cooling beside her, the untouched coffee dark as ink. The notes she had written the night before stared back at her from the page. Unfinished phrases, hesitant and incomplete, as if the melody itself no longer trusted her to carry it. Outside, the city was waking, footsteps on cobblestone, the distant rumble of delivery carts, a faint melody from an accordion somewhere down the street. But within the apartment, silence reigned. Not peaceful, but expectant, the kind of silence that holds its breath, waiting for something that never comes. She used to love this space. When they first moved in, she'd imagined it as their shared sanctuary, music drifting from one room to another, laughter echoing in the kitchen, late-night wine and whispered dreams about the future. But now, Every object seemed to bear witness to her gradual displacement. His books lined the shelves. His portraits watched from the walls. His career bloomed across the newspapers stacked on the table. Her world had shrunk to a corner of the living room and the silent company of the piano. It wasn't that he had forbidden her presence. It was worse. He had made it unnecessary. When Alexander left each morning, he did so with the ease of someone stepping into a world where he belonged completely. Evelyn watched from the window as he crossed the square below, greeted by the concierge, the baker, the young violinist who smiled too brightly when he passed. Every gesture reminded her of what she had never been allowed to have, the unthinking comfort of visibility. She had once been bold, unafraid of space. In New York, she had moved through rehearsal halls and jazz clubs with the confidence of a woman who knew her worth. But in Paris, that assurance had begun to unravel thread by thread. The city adored her music when it didn't know it was hers. The Philharmonic had performed one of her early compositions at a charity gala, rearranged, retitled, attributed to an anonymous contributor. When she heard it, sitting among the audience, she had felt something inside her twist painfully. The melody was hers, but her name had been erased. The applause, too, was stolen. That night, she had asked Alexander why he hadn't told them the truth. His answer was smooth, practiced. "Paris isn't ready," he'd said. "They can be rigid about these things. You must be patient. Once they respect me enough, I'll have the freedom to bring you into it." Into it. The phrase lingered like smoke, as if she were waiting for an invitation to enter her own life. He wasn't cruel, at least not in the ways that leave bruises. His kindness was quieter, more deceptive. A warm hand at her back guiding her just slightly out of frame. "Not tonight," he'd say before a concert. "Not this time," before a reception. Each time he meant it as reassurance, and each time she pretended to believe him. Because love, when it's honest, asks for faith. And when it isn't, it demands silence. Evelyn began to keep her own kind of company. She visited cafes along the left bank, where no one recognized her as the conductor's invisible wife. She read in the corner, sketching fragments of new compositions in the margins of her notebook. Restless, searching pieces that never found resolution. Music became her only confessor, the one place she could still speak without fear of being dismissed. One afternoon, while leaving a rehearsal Alexander had forgotten to mention, she overheard two critics talking near the foyer. "Pierce is remarkable," one said, "a man of exquisite taste. He has a way of refining everything around him. Even his circle," the other replied with a wry smile. "He knows what belongs in Paris, and what doesn't." The words fell lightly, almost casually, but they sliced through her like glass. Evelyn walked home beneath a sky the color of lead. She told herself not to cry. Tears would make it too real. Yet as she crossed the Pont Neuf, a drizzle began, soft and relentless, mingling with the salt on her cheeks. She stopped at the center of the bridge, watching the river darken beneath her. The Seine reflected the city's light, perfect, distant, uncaring. For a moment she envied the water. It belonged nowhere, yet it moved freely through everything. That night, she returned to the apartment to find Alexander at the piano, playing the new overture he'd been working on. It was delicate, romantic, and hauntingly familiar. She stood behind him, listening, and then realized it was built upon one of her discarded motifs, a melody she had written months ago and left unfinished. When the final note faded, she spoke quietly. "It's beautiful." He turned, surprised but pleased. "You think so?" "I do. It sounds like me." For a brief second, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, recognition, maybe even shame. But then it was gone, replaced by the easy confidence of a man accustomed to forgiveness. "Your influence is everywhere," he said lightly, and kissed her forehead as if that absolved him. She smiled because she didn't know what else to do. But when he went to bed, she sat down at the piano and began to play the melody again. Her melody, the one he'd borrowed and renamed. Only this time she changed it. She added a dissonant chord, then another, twisting the harmony until it no longer fit his composition. It was hers again, imperfect, aching, alive. As the hours passed, the city outside fell into sleep, but Evelyn stayed awake, letting her fingers find their own rhythm. Somewhere between the notes, she began to see her life with new clarity. She realized that belonging, as Alexander defined it, was not the same as love. Belonging in his world meant obedience, invisibility, containment. But the belonging she needed was different, not to a place, not to a man, but to herself. When dawn broke, pale and quiet, she looked at the pages scattered across the piano. The music was raw, unresolved, but it was true. For the first time in months, she felt a pulse of something fierce inside her. Not hope exactly, but the first flicker of resistance. She didn't yet know where it would lead, only that she was done asking permission to exist in a life she had helped build. And as the sun rose over Paris, gilding the rooftops in fragile light, Evelyn whispered into the silence, "I still belong to me." It began with an image, a frozen instant, beautiful and cruel. Evelyn wasn't searching for it. She had only wanted distraction, a moment's escape into the ordinary rhythm of her morning. Black coffee, half-finished toast, and the soft rustle of the Parisian arts pages she had learned to read like weather reports on her husband's world. The photograph appeared halfway down the column, small, elegant, but impossible to miss. Alexander stood in the center, his smile artfully effortless, his tuxedo immaculate. One hand rested on the small of a young woman's back, Clara Voss, the violinist whose name had begun to drift around the Philharmonic like a new refrain. The caption beneath glowed in silver script, "The maestro and his muse at the Montparnasse Gala." For a long moment, Evelyn didn't move. She simply stared, her mind struggling to translate the symbols before her, the tilt of Clara's head, the intimacy of his hand, the expression that once belonged only to her. There was no accusation in the image, no overt betrayal. It was more subtle than that, more practiced, a tableau of effortless charm, the kind that feeds on public approval. But Evelyn understood what lay beneath its polish. She had lived inside that practiced composure long enough to recognize when something sacred had been replaced by performance. The air in the apartment felt heavier somehow, as if even the walls could sense the shift. She folded the paper, set it aside, and tried to breathe. She told herself it was nothing. A photo taken at an event she hadn't been invited to, with a colleague, nothing more. Yet her pulse betrayed her. The lie trembled inside her chest like a trapped bird. That evening, when Alexander returned home, she didn't mention it. He kissed her cheek distractedly, poured himself a drink, and began speaking of rehearsals, of donors, of how Clara's interpretation of the Mendelssohn concerto had moved the audience to tears. Evelyn listened, silent, her fingers tightening around her glass. Every word he spoke was a confession, though he didn't seem to realize it. Later, while he showered, she retrieved the newspaper from the waste bin. The photograph was smudged now, damp from the discarded coffee grounds. Still, she traced the outlines with her thumb. The gleam of Clara's violin, the warmth in Alexander's eyes. A love story rehearsed for an audience, broadcast to a world that had never known she existed. The next morning, she walked to the Galerie Dorée, where she and Alexander had once attended an exhibition during their first spring in Paris. Back then, the gallery had been their secret refuge, a place where music and color seemed to blend, where they could simply be Evelyn and Alexander, not composer and conductor, not husband and wife disguised by circumstance. She hadn't been back since. Now, the space felt different. The air smelled faintly of roses and fresh paint, and the new curator, a poised woman with copper earrings and quiet authority, greeted her warmly. "I remember you," the woman said. "You came here with Monsieur Pierce, didn't you? You spoke about how color is like harmony." Evelyn smiled faintly. Yes, that was a long time ago. They wandered through the gallery together, speaking of light, composition, and how art often reflects the secrets people can't say aloud. At one point, the curator paused beside a painting of a woman standing before a mirror, her reflection blurred into abstraction. "She's not looking at herself," the curator said softly. "She's searching for what she's lost." The words struck Evelyn like a whisper of prophecy. When she returned home, Alexander was at his desk, annotating a new score. His pen moved in swift, decisive strokes, the same way he had once conducted her heart. She stood in the doorway for a long time, watching him. This man she had loved so completely that she'd mistaken his silence for protection. "Alex," she said quietly. He looked up, startled. "You're home early. Do you ever miss New York?" He hesitated. "Sometimes." "Why?" "Because I do. It's where we could be ourselves, before the world started deciding who we should be." He smiled faintly, as though humoring a child. "Paris is better for us, Evie. For me, especially. You'll see." She nodded, though her heart had already answered. Paris was better for him. That night, unable to sleep, she opened her laptop and began scrolling through photographs from his recent concerts. Image after image, the same smile, the same practiced grace, Clara's familiar presence hovering near. Every click felt like another unraveling thread. Then she paused on one photo she hadn't seen before. Not from a gala, but from a private dinner. Alexander and Clara were seated closely, their heads bent together, laughter frozen mid-breath. His hand rested on hers. Evelyn's throat tightened, but not from shock. There are betrayals that arrive like thunderclaps, and others that fall like snow. Silent, soft, but so relentless they bury everything in sight. She realized then that this wasn't the first photograph. It was simply the first she'd been allowed to see. In the days that followed, she drifted through her life as if underwater. Each movement felt slowed, deliberate, muted. Alexander noticed her quietness, perhaps even her distance, but mistook it for fatigue. He brought her flowers one evening, white lilies, her favorite, and kissed her forehead with the gentleness of habit. She thanked him, arranged the flowers in a vase, and watched as they opened over the next few days, pale, fragrant, dying beautifully. One evening, she caught her reflection in the mirror across the room and was startled by what she saw. A woman perfectly still, elegant, composed, yet behind her calm eyes lingered a shadow of someone who had once burned with music and truth. She studied herself as if she were the woman in that gallery painting, standing before a mirror, searching for what she'd lost. And slowly, quietly, Evelyn understood. She wasn't only grieving a man. She was grieving the version of herself she had traded for his comfort. The photograph had done more than expose his betrayal. It had forced her to see her own. For the first time, she didn't cry. She simply folded the newspaper clippings and tucked them into her notebook, between the pages of her unfinished composition. The one she had titled long ago, Resonance. The name felt prophetic now. Her silence had echoed long enough. And somewhere, beneath the ache, a single, fragile thought began to take shape. Not yet hope, but something like it. A recognition that even in erasure, she still existed. And that one day soon, she would make the world remember her name. Paris had entered that peculiar hour between evening and night, when the city seemed to exhale, a slow, wistful sigh that drifted through the boulevards and lingered above the rooftops. The cafes glowed softly, their windows fogged with warmth, laughter, and the fragrance of roasted coffee and rain-damp wool. Evelyn Monroe walked without direction, her coat unbuttoned, the cold air steady against her skin. She didn't know why her steps led her to Café du Lys that night. Perhaps it was the music, faint, sultry, bleeding from the doorway, a saxophone bending through a familiar jazz progression. Or perhaps it was instinct, that quiet intuition that draws the lost toward the places where they might be found again. Inside, the cafe was small and intimate, the kind of place that looked unchanged for decades. The wallpaper was faded, the tables scarred by time, and a haze of cigarette smoke curled lazily beneath the chandeliers. At the far end, a woman sat at an upright piano, her fingers wandering across the keys with the ease of memory. Her hair was silver, her skin a deep, luminous bronze, and her presence filled the room like perfume, subtle but impossible to ignore. Evelyn stood transfixed as the woman shifted from Debussy to Coltrane without warning, weaving the classical and the improvisational into a single, seamless river of sound. When the last note faded, the cafe erupted in applause. The woman smiled faintly, as though the music had been a private conversation the audience had accidentally overheard. As Evelyn turned to leave, their eyes met. An instant of recognition, not of faces, but of spirit. "Don't run off yet," the woman called, her voice warm and textured, like velvet worn soft by years of use. Sit. You look like someone who needs a place to rest her thoughts. Evelyn hesitated, then obeyed. The woman gestured toward the seat beside her at the piano. I'm Lucille Diop, she said. Once upon a time, I played with the kind of men who thought women were ornaments for the stage. She laughed softly, pouring herself a cup of black coffee. Now I play for the ghosts who stayed behind. Evelyn, she replied. Composer, occasionally invisible. Lucille studied her for a moment, not with curiosity, but with understanding. Ah, one of those who built a world and got locked out of it. Something in Evelyn's throat tightened. How did you know? Lucille's smile was kind but knowing. Because I've been there. Every woman who's ever made something beautiful in a room full of men learns the same lesson. They'll hum your melody, but they'll forget who wrote it. The words landed like truth wrapped in tenderness. Evelyn said nothing. She didn't need to. Lucille leaned back, lighting a cigarette, the smoke spiraling like unfinished phrases. So, tell me about the one who made you forget your own name. Evelyn hesitated. He didn't make me forget, she said slowly. He just built a world where remembering it hurt. Lucille exhaled, the smoke curling around her smile. Then he succeeded. The cruelest silencing is the one that feels like love. They spoke for hours, about art, about womanhood, about the strange hunger that drives creation. Evelyn found herself saying things she hadn't told anyone. How Alexander's charm had become a cage. How his success was lined with her unacknowledged fingerprints. How she had begun to mistake erasure for devotion. Lucille listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her hands folded as if holding something fragile. When Evelyn finished, the older woman nodded, her voice quiet but sharp as a blade. You've been living like a muted instrument, darling, waiting for someone else to give you permission to sound again. But your silence, that's his symphony, not yours. Evelyn looked down, tracing the rim of her cup. I don't even know where to start. Lucille smiled, tapping ash into the tray. Start where it hurts the most. That's where the truth lives. And when you find it, don't whisper it. Play it so loud they can't pretend not to hear. The cafe began to empty, the night thinning into stillness. Lucille turned back to the piano, her fingers testing a quiet chord. Do you know why I still play? She asked. Because music never lies. You can tell it anything. Your shame, your fury, your grief. And it will give you back something purer. That's the miracle of it. Evelyn watched her, captivated. There was something ancient in the way Lucille played, not in age, but in wisdom, in the unapologetic truth of her sound. It was the sound of a woman who had outlived other people's expectations. Come here, Lucille said gently, sliding over on the bench. Play something for me. Evelyn hesitated. Her hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. For months, she hadn't been able to play without feeling like an intruder in her own craft. But now, under Lucille's watchful calm, the fear began to loosen. She played the first melody that came to her, low, hesitant, fragile. It was the tune she had once written for Alexander, long before the lies. But halfway through, she changed it. The rhythm shifted. The chords turned raw and unresolved. Something wild emerged, something truer. Lucille closed her eyes, nodding to the beat. When Evelyn finished, there was a long, reverent silence. There she is, Lucille whispered. I was wondering when you'd let her out. Evelyn felt her chest tighten, not with sorrow this time, but with something dangerously close to relief. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed her own voice until she heard it again. Lucille smiled and patted her hand. You're not broken, child. You're just unpublished. And the world has a bad habit of mistaking quiet women for absent ones. So what are you going to do with that truth now that it's back in your hands? Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't have to. Somewhere deep inside her, a decision had already begun to form. Small, steady, inevitable. Outside, the rain had stopped. Paris gleamed under the streetlights, every puddle a tiny mirror. Evelyn stood at the cafe door, turning back once more. Lucille was at the piano again, lost in her own melody. And as Evelyn stepped out into the night, she realized she was no longer walking to escape her life. She was walking toward it. The city no longer felt like an exile. It felt like a stage waiting for her return. The first lie she confirmed was her own, that she didn't need to know. For weeks after that night at the cafe, Evelyn tried to return to her ordinary rhythms, teaching a few lessons, composing fragments of unfinished music, pretending to sleep beside a man whose absence filled the bed more than his body did. But Lucille's words lingered, soft and unrelenting, like a melody that refused to leave her head. Start where it hurts the most. So she did. It began quietly, as most awakenings do. Evelyn started collecting small details, the late rehearsals that didn't match his schedule, the messages that arrived with his half apologies. Just meetings, Evie. Don't wait up. The faint trace of another perfume she couldn't name. She stopped trying to rationalize, stopped offering him the tenderness of her doubt. Instead, she watched, listened, waited. Each discovery felt less like revelation and more like confirmation of something she had already known. A lipstick stain on a program, a double reservation at a restaurant she'd never been to, the scent of lilacs on his scarf when she knew he hated flowers. But knowledge, once it begins, demands completion. One morning, she found herself standing outside a small private detective's office in the 9th arrondissement. The sign on the window read, Dubois and Fils, Discreet Inquiries. She hesitated on the threshold, feeling absurd, even theatrical. What was she doing here? The woman who once believed in nothing but art and sincerity, now paying to confirm her heartbreak. Inside, the office smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. The man who greeted her, Monsieur Dubois, was small and composed, with a face like parchment and a voice made for secrets. How may I help you, madam? She slid a photograph of Alexander across the desk. My husband, she said simply. I need to know where he goes when he says he's rehearsing. Dubois didn't look surprised. Do you wish for confirmation or for truth? Evelyn met his gaze. Both. He nodded as though he had heard that answer 100 times. Then you will have it. The days that followed felt suspended, each hour stretched thin with waiting. Evelyn went about her routine mechanically, grocery shopping, piano practice, answering polite messages from students, while the city continued around her, oblivious to the quiet unraveling taking place within her chest. A week later, she received the envelope, plain, cream-colored, her name written in tidy handwriting across the front. Inside were photographs, time-stamped reports, and one small USB drive. She sat at the kitchen table for a long while before she opened it, the weight of her own breath the only sound in the room. The photographs were clean, precise, without malice, the sort of images that might have been innocent in another life. Alexander and Clara leaving a hotel near the Champs-Élysées. A dinner. Wine glasses tilted in intimate reflection. A walk through the gardens at dusk, her hands slipping easily into his. There was a picture of them sitting close in a cafe, their heads bent together, laughter frozen mid-breath. The same cafe where he had once first kissed Evelyn. On the USB drive, a short audio clip, his voice unmistakable, steady and composed. My marriage was a mistake of impulse, he was saying. She doesn't belong in this world. I can't undo it, but I can control what people see. The words played once, twice, until they became sound without meaning. A pattern of tones that no longer resembled speech, only betrayal. Evelyn pressed her hand against her chest, as if to contain something from breaking loose. She didn't cry. Instead, she listened to the silence that followed. Sharp, absolute, the kind that feels almost holy. That evening, she went to Lucille's cafe again. The older woman took one look at her and poured 2 brandies without asking. So, Lucille said softly, you found your truth. Evelyn nodded. It's worse than I thought. It always is. Lies are built to be beautiful. Truth rarely bothers with that. Evelyn took a slow sip, the burn grounding her. He said I don't belong in his world. Lucille smiled sadly. Then he never deserved to live in yours. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, rain pressed softly against the windows, blurring the city lights. Evelyn found herself tracing circles on the table with her finger, a habit she had when thinking through difficult musical passages. What now? Lucille asked. Evelyn stared into her glass. I don't know. I feel like I've spent years writing a symphony that only he got to perform. Then take it back, Lucille said simply. Every woman I've ever admired learned to conduct her own ruin, turn it into art, into something that outlasts him. Evelyn smiled faintly. You make it sound easy. It isn't, but it's necessary. That night, Evelyn walked home beneath a sky the color of steel. Paris shimmered around her, beautiful, merciless, indifferent. She carried the envelope in her bag like evidence of a crime that no court could prosecute. But in a strange way, she felt lighter. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a clarity so sharp it almost hurt. When she reached the apartment, Alexander was already asleep, his breathing deep and even. She stood in the doorway watching him, the rise and fall of his chest, the man she had once trusted with every secret. How small he looked now, how ordinary. She wanted to wake him, to ask why. Not because she expected an answer, but because she wanted to see if he could still lie while looking her in the eyes. But she didn't. She turned instead toward the piano, lit only by the street lamp's glow filtering through the curtains. Evelyn opened her notebook to a blank page and began to write. Not music this time. Words. A confession. A plan. A reclamation. She didn't yet know what form it would take, only that it would be hers. The city outside moved like a slow symphony, the whisper of rain, the hum of distant traffic, the occasional cry of a nightbird over the Seine. And somewhere within that soundscape, Evelyn felt the first stirrings of resolve. The investigation had given her what she asked for, the truth, but what it left her with was something far more dangerous, the beginning of power. The night she decided to return to the world was quiet, almost deceptively so. Paris lay beneath a thin veil of rain, the kind that softened the edges of everything it touched. Evelyn sat by the window of her apartment, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her, the envelope from Dubois resting like a final punctuation mark on the table. She had spent days circling her own thoughts, moving between fury and sorrow, between disbelief and the strange calm that follows devastation. But beneath it all, something fierce had begun to awaken, a pulse steady and deliberate, like the slow ascent of a symphony before its crescendo. She was done being silent. It wasn't vengeance that moved her, not entirely. It was reclamation, a voice of dignity, of authorship. She had been written out of her own story, and now she meant to write herself back in. Her plan came together not as strategy, but as composition. Each decision found its place, like a note aligning to rhythm. The Paris Philharmonic's annual gala, the same one where Alexander had once presented Clara as his muse, was approaching. It was to be the grand event of the season. Royalty, donors, critics, and every name that mattered in the glittering ecosystem of European music. Tickets were exclusive, impossible to obtain without invitation. But Evelyn, ever resourceful, understood that access was rarely about permission. It was about precision. She began by contacting an old patron from her early days in New York, Madame Corinne Devereux, an arts benefactor who owed Evelyn a favor from a time when her foundation's reputation had been saved by Evelyn's composition. Corinne listened to her quietly over the phone, and when Evelyn finished, there was a pause, the kind that lives between sympathy and admiration. "My dear," Corinne said finally, her voice rich with intrigue, "you've always known how to make the air shift around you. I'll ensure your name appears on the guest list. And Evelyn," her tone softened, "make sure they remember you this time." The next step required something less tangible, courage disguised as poise. Evelyn spent days rehearsing her entrance in the quiet of her room, not as vanity but as preparation. She chose her gown deliberately. Midnight blue silk, cut in elegant lines that caught the light like the surface of water. Around her neck she placed a single pearl, a gift from her mother, small, luminous, unyielding. Every detail, from her posture to the measured rhythm of her breath, was a declaration of intent. When the evening of the gala arrived, she took a taxi to the Palais Garnier. The city outside glowed with orchestral brilliance, carriages and limousines lining the Grand Avenue, camera flashes slicing through the drizzle, music drifting faintly from within. As she stepped from the car, time seemed to slow. Heads turned, some in curiosity, others in confusion. The doorman, mistaking her self-assuredness for belonging, extended a gloved hand and ushered her inside. The interior of the opera house was a dream of gold and marble. Chandeliers cascaded light across velvet staircases. The scent of perfume and ambition filled the air. She could hear the murmur of conversations, names whispered like currency, laughter polished smooth with pretense. Evelyn moved through it all like a melody rediscovering its rhythm. She greeted no one, sought no approval. The whispers followed her, soft and uncertain, the way sound follows light. When she entered the grand hall, the orchestra was already on stage. Alexander stood at the podium, his posture commanding, his presence undeniable. Beside him sat Clara, radiant in ivory silk, her violin resting gracefully against her collarbone. They looked every bit the vision the city adored. The maestro and his muse, perfection embodied. Evelyn felt no tremor of doubt, no hesitation. She took her place near the center aisle, her gaze fixed calmly on the man who had once convinced her that invisibility was a kind of love. The concert began. The music was exquisite, polished, flawless, lifeless. It was the sound of control, of precision without passion. Evelyn listened, not as an audience member, but as a composer dissecting a counterfeit score. Midway through the second movement, the conductor's baton faltered ever so slightly. Alexander's eyes had lifted from his orchestra, scanning the crowd, and for the briefest second, he saw her. The color drained from his face. His hand trembled. The violin stumbled over a note, the harmony collapsing for a fraction of a beat before recovering. The audience noticed, but only as an imperfection too subtle to name. Evelyn didn't move. She simply met his gaze, steady, unflinching, undeniable. When the performance ended, applause erupted through the hall. Alexander bowed deeply, his composure restored by sheer will, while photographers rushed forward to capture him and Clara under the chandeliers. Evelyn waited until the noise swelled to its peak. Then she stepped forward. Her heels echoed sharply against the marble, cutting through the applause. The crowd turned. Even the cameras hesitated. She stopped at the edge of the stage, her presence commanding in its calm. "Good evening, maestro," she said softly, her voice carrying easily through the hall. "It's been some time." The room fell into stillness. Alexander blinked, frozen, as though confronted by an apparition. "Evelyn," he managed, his voice a half-breath. "What are you doing here?" She smiled, serene, unhurried, listening to the music that used to belong to both of us. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The phrase was simple, but the weight of it hung in the air like prophecy. Evelyn reached into her clutch and unfolded a single page. A score. The original manuscript of Resonance, her signature scrawled neatly at the bottom. "You remember this one, don't you?" she said. "It was the first piece we ever wrote together. I found it, rearranged. This is it." Alexander opened his mouth, but no sound came. The photographers had stopped flashing. The audience waited, caught in the rapture of disbelief. Evelyn didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She simply placed the page on the edge of the stage, a silent offering, a fragment of truth reclaimed, and turned to leave. As she walked down the aisle, her footsteps measured and steady, the murmurs behind her grew louder, spreading like the slow awakening of an audience realizing it had been watching the wrong story all along. Outside, the rain had returned, soft and cleansing. Evelyn stepped into it, unafraid of being seen. For the first time in years, she felt her body filled with something that wasn't grief. It was clarity, electric and alive. She had entered the hall as a ghost. She left it as the author of her own resurrection. Behind her, applause began again, hesitant at first, then rising, genuine and thunderous. But it wasn't for Alexander, not anymore. It was for the woman who had walked back into her story and reclaimed her name. The night before the gala, Paris held its breath. The sky was low and heavy, silvered with the promise of rain, the kind that falls softly yet feels like confession. Evelyn Monroe sat at her piano in the half-dark, her fingers tracing the edges of silence. She wasn't playing, not yet. She was listening, waiting for the courage to arrive fully. It came slowly, not as a surge of bravado, but as an unmistakable stillness, the kind one feels before the curtain lifts. She had spent weeks preparing for this night, but not in the way one prepares for war. This was an act of resurrection. Her revenge would not be loud. It would be elegant, composed, deliberate, undeniable. On the table beside her lay the score of Resonance, the original version, the one Alexander had once performed under his name. The pages were worn at the edges, stained faintly with coffee and tears, her handwriting looping across the margins like veins of memory. She had decided to bring it with her, not as proof, but as symbol, the artifact of a voice reclaimed. Outside, thunder murmured distantly. Paris glittered in its quiet defiance, the way it always did when beauty threatened to dissolve into storm. Evelyn rose, walked to her mirror, and studied the reflection of the woman staring back at her. Gone was the softness of hesitation. Her eyes were clear, her mouth steady. The midnight gown she had chosen seemed to hold its own light, the fabric rippling like the surface of deep water. Around her wrist she wore a thin bracelet of gold, a gift from her mother, engraved with the words, "Know your worth, and the world will learn to speak it." She touched it gently. "You'd be proud of me," she whispered into the empty room. "I'm not running anymore." The clock chimed 8. Time to go. The car that carried her to the Palais Garnier glided through streets that shimmered with rain. Through the window she watched Paris unfold, its marble facades luminous, its cafes alive with murmurs, its river swollen with reflection. The city no longer felt like a place of exile. It felt like an accomplice, its grandeur conspiring quietly with her intent. When she arrived, the plaza outside the opera house pulsed with flashbulbs and laughter. Journalists gathered like moths, their cameras devouring the arrivals. Royalty, politicians, the impossibly beautiful. Evelyn stepped out of the car and felt the weight of their gaze hesitate. They didn't know her name, but they sensed something in her bearing. A calm authority that defied their need to categorize. She walked through the grand doors, her heels clicking softly on the marble. The chandeliers blazed above her, scattering light like applause. She could almost hear the echo of her own heartbeat, steady and unhurried, as if it were keeping time to the music waiting on the other side of the doors. Inside, the hall glowed with opulent expectation. The Philharmonic's orchestra was already in place, instruments gleaming under the stage lights. Guests filled the velvet seats, patrons of art, critics with pens sharpened like blades, socialites hungry for spectacle. And there, at the center of it all, stood Alexander Pierce. He was immaculate, of course. His tuxedo fit him like certainty, his expression composed in that familiar blend of humility and pride. The audience adored him, their perfect American maestro who had conquered the Parisian stage. Clara Voss hovered nearby, luminous in white, the embodiment of effortless grace. Together they were the picture of harmony, a lie painted so beautifully it almost deserved to be believed. Evelyn watched from the shadows of the aisle, her presence unnoticed, her resolve unshaken. She had once admired the way he commanded attention. Now she saw it for what it was, control disguised as art. Every gesture, every glance, every note was orchestrated to maintain illusion. But illusions, like music, depend on timing, and Evelyn had perfect timing. The orchestra began its opening movement, and Alexander's hands rose, slicing through the air with precision. The music swelled, lush and symphonic. The audience leaned forward, enraptured. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, listening. She knew every measure, every transition, every emotional pivot. She had written its bones, though no one here knew it. She imagined what it must feel like for him now, so certain of his dominion, so unaware that the ground beneath him was beginning to tremble. For the first time, she didn't feel pain. She felt anticipation. When the first intermission came, the audience spilled into the foyer, a sea of glittering fabrics and murmured admiration. Evelyn moved among them like a shadow of poise, smiling faintly, offering polite nods, her anonymity her greatest weapon. She caught fragments of conversation as she passed. "Pierce is transcendent tonight. Did you see how he guided her in the cadenza? Flawless chemistry. Ah, the American genius. He makes even our maestros look provincial." Evelyn let their words wash over her, each one a testament to the illusion she was about to dismantle. At the bar, a familiar voice stopped her. "Madame Monroe." She turned. It was Corinne Devereux, resplendent in emerald satin, her eyes alight with mischief and pride. "I didn't think you'd actually come," Corinne said, lowering her voice. "You look magnificent, my dear. Are you ready?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "I've been ready for years." Corinne studied her, then reached out and squeezed her hand. Then let him hear the silence he created. The second half of the concert began. Evelyn returned to her seat, her pulse calm, her mind sharp. The air in the hall felt charged, as if every crystal on the chandeliers was listening. Alexander lifted his baton again. The lights dimmed, the audience hushed, and music rose like a wave, grand, immaculate, and hollow. Evelyn watched him, her expression serene, almost tender. Once this had been the man she believed in, the man whose passion had awakened her own. Now he stood on stage, conducting her stolen symphony before a city that believed it was his. And yet, for all his mastery, she saw something she had never noticed before. A flicker of strain, the faintest crack in his control. Perhaps he sensed her presence without knowing why. Perhaps guilt, like music, has a frequency that cannot be hidden. As the final movement began, Evelyn rose quietly from her seat. Heads turned, whispers flickered like kindling. She walked down the central aisle, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the chandeliers. The orchestra played on, unaware that their performance was no longer the most important story unfolding in that room. When she reached the front row, Alexander looked up, and their eyes met. For the briefest heartbeat, the entire hall seemed to still. The baton wavered, a note faltered, and in that fragile pause, before anyone understood what was happening, before the illusion shattered completely, Evelyn felt the balance of power shift. The music resumed, but something in the air had changed. Every sound, every gaze, every breath in that hall belonged to her now. It was no longer his performance. It was her prelude. The exposure was already underway. For a single, suspended moment, all of Paris seemed to hold its breath. The Philharmonic Hall, radiant in gold and crystal, existed in a silence so profound it bordered on reverence. On stage, the orchestra froze mid-motion, bows poised in air, brass glinting under chandeliers. Every eye turned toward the woman standing at the edge of the aisle, her midnight gown catching the light like a ripple across deep water. Evelyn Monroe did not tremble. She could feel the electricity of curiosity sweep through the crowd, a wave of whispers and sharp inhales. But her gaze was fixed only on one man, the conductor whose hands now hung helpless at his sides. Alexander Pierce. He had seen her, truly seen her, and in that instant, the world he'd so carefully constructed began to fracture. She took a step forward. The sound of her heels against marble echoed like a metronome counting down to truth. "Good evening, maestro," she said softly, her voice carrying with unsettling clarity. "It's been a long time." Her words floated into the stillness, unhurried and deliberate. There was no anger in them, no plea, only an even calm that sliced sharper than accusation. Alexander's face paled beneath the stage lights. He recovered just enough to force a smile, that practiced, diplomatic smile that had once charmed every critic in Paris. "Evelyn," he managed, his voice straining against the quiet. This isn't what?" she interrupted gently. "The time, the place, the truth?" The audience murmured. Cameras flashed. Clara Voss, seated to Alexander's left, her violin trembling slightly in her hands, glanced between them, confusion tightening her perfect features. Evelyn reached into her clutch and drew out a folded sheet of paper, its edges worn and softened by years of neglect. "You remember this, I'm sure," she said. "Resonance, our first composition. Except, of course, the version you performed had a different name and a different author." Alexander's jaw tightened. "This isn't necessary." "On the contrary," she said, taking another step closer. "It's long overdue." She placed the page on the lip of the stage. The audience leaned forward as if gravity itself had shifted. From where she stood, the notes gleamed faintly under the lights, her handwriting unmistakable. Evelyn turned toward the crowd, her voice steady and resonant. "For years I've listened to music that once belonged to both of us, performed under someone else's name. I was told to be patient, to be invisible, to let brilliance shine unshadowed by truth. I believed that love required silence. I was wrong. The room was utterly still. Somewhere in the balcony, a shutter clicked. She looked back at Alexander. Do you remember what you told me, that first winter in New York? You said the most dangerous thing a woman could do was to compose honestly. That truth makes men uncomfortable. You were right about that. He stepped forward, his composure unraveling, his voice hushed but desperate. Evelyn, please, don't do this here. Here, she repeated. You mean where it matters? Her words struck like a chord, one perfectly tuned to pierce illusion. Clara rose suddenly, her face ghost white. Alexander, she whispered, what is she talking about? Evelyn turned to her with unexpected gentleness. He didn't tell you either, did he? He never tells the whole story, only the version that flatters the listener. A ripple of unease spread through the audience. The whispers grew bolder now, threading through the hall. Alexander's eyes darted toward the orchestra, as if seeking rescue. None came. The musicians remained motionless, their expressions carefully blank, unwilling to intervene in a revelation they knew would live in legend. Evelyn took one final step toward the stage. I don't want your apology, she said softly. I want my name back. For a long, unbearable moment, the two of them stood there, husband and wife, genius and ghost, truth and facade, facing each other under the scrutiny of hundreds. Then she reached for her left hand, sliding the slender gold band from her finger. She held it up, its small circle gleaming in the light. And for the first time in years, she smiled. Not bitterly, not triumphantly, but with liberation. Keep it, she said, placing the ring beside the sheet of music. It suits you, a symbol of something complete that never was. Gasps swept through the hall. Alexander tried to speak, but the words collapsed in his throat. He stood amid the ruins of his own perfection, a man outshone by the very light he once tried to contain. Evelyn turned to the audience. I was told the world wasn't ready for me, she said, but I think the world decides readiness the moment someone dares to stand where they were told not to. Her voice trembled just slightly at the edges, not with weakness, but with the weight of release. And then she turned, her gown whispering against the marble floor, and began to walk back up the aisle. No one moved. The crowd, momentarily robbed of its privilege to look away, watched as she ascended the steps toward the doors. Her steps were steady, measured, the quiet rhythm of reclamation. Behind her, Alexander stood motionless on the stage, staring at the ring and the manuscript, two small objects that now glowed with the unbearable proof of his deceit. Clara lowered her violin, her bow hand trembling, her gaze fixed on him with dawning horror. The silence stretched, until, somewhere in the back, a single person began to clap, then another, then another. The applause spread, hesitant at first, then swelling into a thunder that filled the hall. It was not for the conductor. It was for the woman who had spoken the truth. Evelyn didn't look back. The marble doors opened before her, spilling cold night air into the room like absolution. As she stepped out beneath the rain, her reflection flickered briefly in the glass. The same city that had once erased her now shimmering around her like a stage finally reclaimed. For the first time in years, she felt weightless. Not because she had been vindicated, but because she had stopped needing to be. Inside the hall, the orchestra remained frozen, the instruments still gleaming under the light, waiting for a baton that would never rise again. By dawn, the story had already spread through the veins of Paris. It raced down the boulevards with the morning papers, whispered through cafes between sips of espresso, rippled through the marble halls of the Philharmonic, where staff spoke in hushed, reverent tones, as though recounting a scene from a film rather than real life. The woman in the blue gown, the maestro's hidden wife, the stolen music. By noon, her name, Evelyn Monroe, was everywhere. Once invisible, now unforgettable. Evelyn woke to the sound of rain tapping gently against the window, the faint hum of a city already rewriting its allegiances. The sky was gray, heavy, indifferent, but she felt strangely weightless. It wasn't triumph she felt. Triumph required a hunger she no longer possessed, but release. The kind that arrives after years of holding your breath. She sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a silk robe, her hair still damp from the shower. On the table lay the morning newspaper, its front page dominated by a photograph from the night before. Her standing in the aisle, gaze steady, while Alexander froze on stage behind her. The headline read, "The composer who refused to disappear." Evelyn studied the image for a long while, then folded the paper neatly and set it aside. She didn't need to read what they were saying. She already knew. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with missed calls and messages. Reporters, producers, strangers offering sympathy or spectacle. Somewhere among them, a message from Lucille waited. "You didn't burn the house down, child. You just opened all the windows." Evelyn smiled faintly. Meanwhile, Alexander's world was collapsing with the precision of a ruined symphony. Sponsors withdrew, performances were postponed indefinitely, and the Philharmonic's board convened an emergency session to discuss the ethical implications of artistic misrepresentation. The same patrons who once toasted his genius now distanced themselves with elegant disapproval. The press hounded him outside his apartment, shouting questions he refused to answer. And when Clara Voss released a quiet statement confirming that she had been unaware of his deception, the public's sympathy shifted further away. Yet none of it gave Evelyn pleasure. She didn't want his humiliation. She wanted his silence. The same silence he had imposed on her for years, to finally mean something. That afternoon, she met with a journalist at a quiet cafe near Montmartre, the same one where she had first met Lucille. The woman interviewing her was young, sharp-eyed, and hesitant at first, unsure whether she was speaking to a scandal or a movement. "Why now?" the journalist asked, voice careful, recorder glinting on the table. Evelyn looked out the window for a moment, watching the rain slide down the glass. "Because for years I believed love and loyalty were the same thing," she said softly. "I thought that protecting his image protected what we had. But love built on silence isn't love, it's containment." The journalist nodded slowly, her pen trembling slightly. "And the music?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "It was always mine. But the truth is, I don't want it back. What I want is to create something new. Something that belongs entirely to me." When the article was published that evening, it wasn't about the scandal. It was about reclamation. The headline read, "Evelyn Monroe, the composer who turned erasure into art." The response was immediate. Letters, invitations, collaborations flooded in. Young musicians sent her messages describing how her story had given them courage. Women from around the world wrote about the ways they too had been made invisible. In boardrooms, studios, marriages, and how they recognized themselves in her defiance. It was overwhelming, but also humbling. She realized that her act of rebellion had become something larger than herself, a mirror for others to see their own quiet rebellions reflected. Meanwhile, Alexander withdrew from public life. His name, once synonymous with brilliance, became a cautionary tale. There were rumors he had left Paris, perhaps to teach somewhere abroad, perhaps to vanish entirely. Evelyn didn't ask. She didn't need to know. Some endings don't require witnesses. Weeks passed. Paris entered the slow thaw of early spring. The rain gave way to a softer light, and the air smelled faintly of lilacs. Evelyn spent her days at the piano, not composing with urgency but with peace. The notes came freely now, unburdened by performance. One afternoon, she received an envelope in the post with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of music, one of Alexander's compositions, and a handwritten note. "I'm sorry I tried to conduct your silence. The music was never mine to claim." She read it once, then folded the page carefully and placed it inside her notebook, between her own unfinished scores. It was not forgiveness she felt, but understanding. Some apologies are less about mending than acknowledging the ruin. That evening, she went for a walk along the Seine. The city shimmered under the lamplight, its reflections rippling across the water like secrets learning how to breathe. She stopped at the Pont Neuf, the same bridge where she had once stood in despair, and leaned against the railing. The wind carried faint strains of music from a nearby street performer, a young cellist playing with raw, unguarded emotion. Evelyn closed her eyes and listened. The melody was unfamiliar, but it pulsed with something she recognized deeply. Freedom. She smiled to herself, realizing that she had become something Alexander never could, a creator untouched by the need for approval. Her life, her music, her name, all reclaimed, reshaped, redefined. That night, she returned home and wrote for hours, her hand moving across the page like someone guided by memory and revelation. The piece she composed was unlike anything she had written before, fierce, untamed, alive. She titled it, The Breaking of Illusions. When she finished, she sat in the dark, the last note still echoing in her chest. The room was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. For the first time in years, Evelyn Monroe was not waiting for applause. She was whole in the silence she had created herself. It began in quiet, as most revolutions do. Not with thunder or applause, but with the stillness that follows surrender. After the chaos of revelation, after the noise and the headlines, Evelyn found herself suspended in a kind of luminous calm. It was as though the air around her had been cleansed of its weight. Paris no longer felt like a city of judgment. It was a city of beginnings. For months, she wrote, the music came to her like a river rediscovering its course. At first, it trickled. Hesitant sketches on parchment, motifs half-remembered from dreams. But soon it surged with unstoppable rhythm. She wrote in the mornings by the window, her fingers stained with ink, her robe wrapped loosely around her as sunlight spilled across the keys. Each note felt like reclamation, the reclaiming of her craft, her womanhood, her very breath. There was no Alexander in these compositions, no shadow of his influence, no echo of his stolen grandeur. What flowed from her hands now was entirely her own, unpolished, raw, electric with emotion. She called the piece Resonance Reborn. It was not simply a revision of the work he had once stolen. It was a rebirth, a symphony written from the wreckage of everything she had endured. The first movement opened in restrained dissonance, a delicate struggle between minor chords that slowly gave way to harmony. The second unfolded with defiance, percussion rising like heartbeat, strings trembling with rage and release. The final movement shimmered with serenity, the quiet triumph of a soul no longer confined by the approval of others. When she finished the score, she sat back and wept, not from sorrow, but from the strange ache of arrival. It was the sound of a woman who had walked through fire and returned carrying her own light. Word of her new work reached New York before she had even sent it. The whispers of her name had become legend in artistic circles. The woman who had confronted her oppressor on stage, the composer who refused to be erased. Invitations poured in, each one more insistent than the last. But it was the Carnegie Hall Orchestra that reached her heart. The director's letter was brief, almost reverent. We have followed your story. The world deserves to hear your truth in its purest form. Would you allow us the honor of premiering your new symphony? Evelyn stared at the words until they blurred. Then, with a slow, steady hand, she wrote her reply. Yes. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of rehearsals and preparation. New York welcomed her with open arms, not as a scandal, but as an artist reborn. She walked through the city streets she had once left behind, feeling the pulse of it under her feet, the taxis, the hum of life, the familiar smell of rain on asphalt. It was not nostalgia she felt, but recognition. The night of the premiere arrived with crisp winter air and the electric tension of history waiting to be made. Backstage, Evelyn stood in a simple black gown, elegant and unadorned. Her hands, though steady, tingled with energy. Through the curtains, she could hear the audience settling, the murmurs, the rustle of programs, the distant clearing of throats. When the conductor appeared beside her, a kind-eyed woman named Maeve Chen, one of the few female conductors in the symphonic world, Evelyn felt a quiet kinship. Ready? Maeve asked, smiling. Evelyn nodded. More than ever, she took her seat in the front row as the lights dimmed. The conductor raised her baton. And then, the first note. It began soft, hesitant, almost shy. A single cello, its tone trembling like the first breath after grief. Then came the violins, answering, questioning, yearning. The orchestra swelled, the air thick with sound and emotion. The music was Evelyn's confession, her eulogy, her resurrection. It carried her story without words. The naive girl who had loved too much, the woman who had been silenced, the artist who had found her way back to herself. Every crescendo was a defiance, every pause a memory, every harmonic shift a reclamation. By the final movement, The hall was trembling. The brass lifted like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The percussion pulsed like heartbeat, and the strings shimmered with the tenderness of forgiveness. The last note hung in the air, suspended, trembling, eternal, before dissolving into silence. No one moved. It was not the stillness of confusion but of reverence. The audience seemed afraid to breathe, as if exhaling might break the fragile beauty that still lingered in the air. Then, a single person stood. Applause erupted, slow at first, then building into a roar that filled the hall. Evelyn rose, turning toward the stage. Maeve gestured to her, calling her forward, and as Evelyn stepped into the light, the audience surged to its feet. For the first time, she stood before them as who she truly was. Not a muse, not a shadow, not the wife of someone else's genius, but a composer in her own right. The applause washed over her like absolution. Among the crowd, she noticed familiar faces, critics who had once dismissed her, students who had written to her, young women clutching programs with trembling hands. They were all there, standing for her, for what she represented. Later that night, after the ovations faded and the hall emptied, Evelyn returned to the stage alone. She walked to the piano and touched its keys lightly, feeling their coolness beneath her fingertips. The hall was dark except for the faint glow of the exit signs. She played a single chord, warm, resonant, perfect, and let it linger. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about justice. It was about presence. The quiet, undeniable truth of existing in one's full self. Evelyn smiled, her reflection rippling faintly in the polished lid of the piano. She thought of Lucille and her smoky laughter, of Paris in the rain, of her mother's words engraved on that golden bracelet. She thought of all the silences she had once mistaken for love. And then she thought of sound, her sound, rising at last, unbound and whole. The symphony of liberation wasn't merely music. It was life rediscovered, translated into melody. And as Evelyn Monroe stood beneath the vaulted ceiling of Carnegie Hall, the echo of her final note still trembling in the air, she understood what freedom truly sounded like. Spring arrived in Paris softly that year, as if the city itself wished to apologize for its earlier cruelties. The chestnut trees bloomed along the Seine, the cafes spilled laughter onto the sidewalks, and the air smelled faintly of rain and lilac. Evelyn returned quietly from New York, her triumph behind her, her peace finally beginning to take root. The past no longer haunted her. It only lingered, a distant melody fading into the final bars of a song that no longer hurt to hear. She rented a small apartment in Montmartre, a space high enough that she could watch the rooftops blush with dawn. The rooms were spare but full of light, and her piano sat near the window, its open lid catching the sunrise each morning. She spent her days teaching, composing, walking. Her life at last had become her own gentle rhythm. It was on one such morning, a quiet Sunday steeped in gold, that the letter arrived. It came without ceremony, tucked among the usual post, its envelope cream-colored and sealed with a wax imprint she didn't recognize. The handwriting, though elegant, trembled slightly, as though written by someone uncertain if they had the right to speak. Evelyn turned it over in her hands for a long moment before breaking the seal. Inside, the pages smelled faintly of perfume and regret. Dear Evelyn, I have rewritten this letter more times than I can count. Every draft has felt either too formal or too fragile. There is no right way, I suppose, to apologize for something you didn't understand while it was happening. But I must try. My name may still carry the weight of resentment for you, and I cannot fault you for that. I am Clara Voss. I am, the violinist who once stood beside Alexander Pierce, playing the music he called his own. The music that was, in truth, yours. Evelyn's hands paused. She let the paper rest on her lap for a moment, feeling the familiar chill of a name that once represented everything she had lost. I met him 3 years ago, the letter continued. He was dazzling, like a man lit from within. When he spoke of art, of perfection, of passion, I believed him. He said he had been hurt before, by someone who could not understand the demands of genius. He never said your name. He painted you as a shadow, a mistake he'd outgrown. I was foolish enough to believe that narrative, to mistake his pain for honesty. I never asked whose music I was truly playing. I didn't want to ask. His world was intoxicating, and I thought I was finally part of something extraordinary. Evelyn drew a slow breath. She remembered those early photos, the ones that had gutted her quietly. Clara, radiant under chandeliers, her eyes bright with the unknowing confidence of someone still inside the illusion. When you walked into the gala that night, I thought you were an intruder, someone come to embarrass him. But then you spoke, calm, clear, unshaking, and I realized how deeply I had been mistaken. I saw in a single instant the architecture of his deceit and the grace with which you dismantled it. You didn't shout. You didn't curse. You simply told the truth. I have never seen anything more powerful. I wanted to reach out to you that night. I wanted to say that I was sorry, not only for what I had become, but for the ease with which I had accepted the comfort of his lie. But I was a coward. It has taken me months to find the courage to write. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the sound of the rain outside steady her. The words were delicate, hesitant, like a violinist plucking an unfamiliar string, unsure of its pitch. After the scandal, I left the Philharmonic. I thought about leaving Paris altogether. But then I began to play again, not for audiences, not for applause, but for myself. I remembered why I loved music before I learned to perform it for someone else's gaze. In that rediscovery, I thought of you. I realized that you had done what so many of us never dare. You chose your own silence over someone else's song. I have nothing to offer you but this, gratitude, for showing me that truth, once spoken, doesn't destroy, it purifies. I owe you the courage to begin again. The letter ended without a signature, only a postscript scrawled hastily at the bottom. P.S. I am premiering a new composition at Salle Courtauld next month. It's dedicated to you. Its title is simple, Apologia. I hope you'll come, even if you sit in the last row, even if you never speak to me again. Evelyn folded the letter carefully, her heart heavy but calm. She sat in silence for a long time, watching dust drift lazily through the morning light. Forgiveness, she thought, was not a door that opened all at once. It was a window that widened slowly until air could pass through again. Weeks later, she went to the concert. She arrived quietly, slipping into the back row just as the lights dimmed. Clara walked onto the stage in a simple black gown, her posture humble, her face pale with anticipation. The first notes were fragile, uncertain, almost trembling. But then, like confession turned into melody, the music grew, tender, mournful, redemptive. It was not apology in words but in sound, the kind of remorse that requires no explanation. Evelyn listened, her eyes glistening, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. When the final note faded, Clara bowed without searching the audience. The applause rose like a wave, gentle but sincere. Evelyn did not stand. She simply watched her, the woman who had once been her replacement, now reborn in her own music. After the crowd dispersed, Evelyn walked to the edge of the stage. Clara was packing her violin, her hands trembling slightly. When she looked up and saw Evelyn, she froze. Evelyn smiled, a small, quiet smile, neither warm nor cold. "It was beautiful," she said. Clara's eyes filled. "You came." "I did." Evelyn paused, then added softly, "We both survived him, didn't we?" Clara nodded, tears glinting like stars. "Thanks to you." Evelyn reached out and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "No," she said, "thanks to truth." And then she turned and left, stepping out into the Paris night where the rain had stopped and the city shone like it had forgiven itself. As she walked home, the melody of Apologia followed her, not as an echo of sorrow, but as the delicate thread of connection between two women who had once been divided by illusion and now bound by clarity. By the time she reached her apartment, the last of the night's music had faded into quiet. Evelyn opened her window and let the cool air in, her heart light with something she hadn't felt in years. Not vindication, not triumph, but peace. Because sometimes redemption doesn't arrive with applause or closure. Sometimes it comes as a letter, written in trembling ink, asking simply to be heard. There are moments in life that unfold so quietly you do not realize their permanence until long after they've passed. For Evelyn Monroe, The months that followed Clara's letter felt like that. A slow, deliberate unfolding. The storm had passed, the applause had faded, and what remained was stillness. Not the silence of loss this time, but the kind that cradles new beginnings. Music had always been her language, but now she began to understand it differently. It was no longer performance, no longer rebellion. It was design, structure, intention. It was architecture. The more she wrote, the more she realized that sound itself had form, that every harmony built a kind of space the listener could inhabit. And perhaps, she thought, healing was not about forgetting pain, but about rebuilding the rooms it had once occupied. Her days fell into rhythm. She woke early, her apartment suffused with pale morning light, and made tea before sitting at her piano. Some days, the melodies came like breath. Other days, she found herself simply tracing patterns in silence, listening to the faint hum of the city below. Paris had softened around her, less a reminder of betrayal now, more a companion in solitude. One evening, she was visited by Lucille, her old mentor, who arrived unannounced, draped in a crimson scarf that smelled faintly of jasmine and tobacco. "You look different," Lucille said, settling into an armchair. "Lighter." "I think I finally stopped trying to prove something," Evelyn replied with a smile. Lucille studied her for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "That's when the real music begins, when you're not chasing an echo." Evelyn poured them both wine. They sat in easy silence for a while, two women bound by the quiet understanding of time and art. Lucille looked around the room. The neatly stacked manuscripts, the softly glowing lamp, the open window letting in the hum of the street. "So," she said finally, "what are you working on now?" Evelyn hesitated, then turned a few pages in her notebook. "It's called The Architecture of Sound. It's not a symphony, not exactly. More like a conversation between what's been destroyed and what remains." Lucille leaned forward, intrigued. "Tell me." "It starts with dissonance, not chaotic, just uncertain. Two themes trying to find each other. Then a motif appears, fragile but persistent, and begins to weave structure out of the discord. The more it repeats, the stronger it becomes, until eventually it holds the entire piece together." She looked up, her eyes glinting with quiet passion. "It's about rebuilding, the way pain can become foundation." Lucille's smile was proud and tender. "My dear, that's not just composition. That's survival turned into geometry." They laughed softly, and Evelyn realized how much she had missed that. Laughter that wasn't a defense, but an ease. In the weeks that followed, the architecture of sound took form. It became a work of deep restraint, all shadow and light, discipline and grace. Where her earlier compositions burned with emotion, this one shimmered with clarity. Each movement reflected a different stage of rebuilding: collapse, framework, resonance, and finally return. The first, collapse, was a slow, fractured lament, chords that stumbled and reassembled themselves like memory learning to walk again. Framework introduced the motif, a quiet rhythm in the lower strings that grew steadier as the piece progressed. Resonance was luminous, the sound of light finding its reflection. And return, the final movement, was pure simplicity, a single melody floating above silence, unhurried and complete. When she finished the final page, she placed her pen down and stared at it for a long moment. It was, she realized, not a requiem, but a blueprint, not for music, but for living. A month later, she was invited to present it at the Maison de la Musique Contemporaine, an avant-garde venue known for celebrating works that defied convention. It was a modest setting compared to the grand concert halls of her past, but that was precisely why she accepted. The piece wasn't meant for spectacle, it was meant to breathe. On the evening of the premiere, the hall was intimate. Only a few hundred seats, the stage bathed in amber light. Evelyn sat in the audience, hidden among the listeners. She had chosen not to perform this time. Instead, she wanted to experience it the way others would, as something separate from herself, something liberated from its creator. When the first note began, she closed her eyes. The sound was soft, hesitant, like memory stirring. The dissonance unfolded gently, without anger, until the motif emerged. that fragile rhythm, repeating, building, layering. As the orchestra reached resonance, Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. The harmonies shimmered like light reflected on water, tender and unguarded. By the time the final movement arrived, the hall had grown so still that even the air seemed to listen. Return drifted like a whisper through the space, one single melody carrying everything that had come before it, transformed and whole. When the last note faded, the audience remained silent for several seconds. It was not the stunned silence of surprise, but the reverent kind that follows revelation. Then came the applause, soft at first, then rising, warm and sustained. Evelyn smiled but did not stand. This wasn't about her. It was about the music finally existing freely in the world, untethered from pain. Later, when the hall had emptied and the night stretched quiet around her, she stayed behind. On the stage, a single music stand remained, illuminated by the faint glow of a spotlight. She walked up and touched it gently. Every structure, she thought, begins with a fracture. Sound, like love, needs space to move, to echo, to return, to heal. She looked out at the empty seats and imagined all the souls who had once filled them. Seekers, lovers, liars, believers. All of them held for a brief moment within her design of sound and silence. And for the first time, she understood that what she had built was not a monument to what she lost, but a home for what she had become. As she turned off the final light and stepped into the cool Paris night, the city hummed around her, alive with its endless symphony of movement. Somewhere in the distance, a street musician played a violin, the notes curling upward like smoke. Evelyn smiled, her heart steady. The architecture was complete, and in its echoes, she finally recognized herself, not as a survivor, not even as a composer, but as the sound itself. The morning after the architecture of sound premiered, Paris was dressed in a light mist, the kind that blurred edges and softened everything it touched. Evelyn awoke before dawn, the echo of her music still pulsing faintly in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt neither the urgency to create nor the ache of unfinished grief. There was only calm, that delicate space between breath and silence where everything simply is. The critics would write about her, she knew. They would call her performance a rebirth of modern romanticism, or a masterwork forged from pain. But none of that mattered. What she had wanted, all she had ever wanted, was to make something honest, something that would outlive her without needing to bear her name. She dressed simply that morning, a cream blouse, a dark skirt, and walked down the quiet streets toward the Seine. The city was still waking. The boulangeries were just beginning to open, and the smell of fresh bread mingled with the scent of damp stone. The river glimmered under a pale sky, its current slow and deliberate, carrying yesterday's reflections away. Evelyn paused on Pont des Arts, the same bridge where years ago she had once stood on the edge of despair. The air was cool, the light soft as a sigh. She leaned on the railing, watching ripples spread outward from a passing boat. "Everything moves," she whispered, "and everything returns." It was Lucille who found her there an hour later, her crimson scarf bright against the gray morning. "I thought I'd find you here," she said. "You always come back to beginnings." Evelyn smiled. "It feels different this time." Lucille studied her gaze warm, knowing, because it is. They walked together for a while, two women bound by shared silence. When they reached the end of the bridge, Lucille stopped. "You've built something extraordinary, Evelyn, but I hope you know, it's not over." Evelyn tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Lucille's smile deepened. "A symphony never truly ends. It only changes hands. Somewhere, right now, another woman is sitting at her piano, afraid her truth is too loud, too inconvenient. She's waiting to hear that it's worth saying. You've already written her permission slip." The words lingered long after Lucille left. That afternoon, Evelyn returned to her apartment and opened the balcony doors. The sound of the city rose to greet her, laughter, footsteps, a violin from somewhere below. She sat at the piano and began to play, not from a score this time, but from memory, fragments of all the lives she had lived. The timid girl who once believed genius belonged to someone else. The woman who had loved a man who mistook her silence for devotion. the composer who had stood alone on a stage and spoken the truth aloud. Each note felt like a farewell and a promise at once. As she played, she noticed something she had never truly seen before: the lights shifting across the room, touching the framed photograph of her mother, the faint reflection of herself in the window, the way sound filled every space without asking permission. The melody deepened, slower, more reflective. It was no longer about triumph or defiance. It was about return, to self, to softness, to sound. When she reached the final chord, she let it linger, resonating in the air long after her hands had lifted from the keys. That was the beauty of sound, she realized. It always leaves something behind, even after it's gone. She rose, walked to the balcony, and looked out over the city. Below her, Paris shimmered like a living symphony, horns from distant traffic blending with birdsong, the murmur of conversation, the faint laughter of a child echoing between stone walls, the music of life itself. Evelyn closed her eyes and smiled. She no longer needed the stage, the audience, the applause. The world itself had become her orchestra. And yet, in that quiet realization, she felt a new kind of calling. Not to perform, but to share. Not to instruct, but to inspire. She began writing letters to students, to women she had mentored, to strangers who had sent her words of gratitude. Each letter began the same way. Music is not what you play. It is what you remember of yourself when the sound fades. Months later, the architecture of sound was performed again, not in Paris or New York this time, but in Nairobi, in Seoul, in Buenos Aires. Conductors wrote to her, asking for guidance. Composers dedicated new works to her courage. Her story became a kind of quiet legend, not of scandal, but of reclamation. And as her music traveled the world, Evelyn began to feel herself dissolve gently into it, not disappearing, but becoming everywhere. In every note played by trembling hands, in every student daring to write her first melody, in every listener who heard themselves inside her sound. On her final evening in Paris before leaving to lecture in Vienna, Evelyn stood once more in her empty apartment. The piano was closed, the manuscript neatly packed. She took one last look around, at the space that had witnessed her solitude, her unraveling, her rebirth. Then, with one final breath, she whispered to the room, "Let it begin again." Outside, the wind stirred, carrying the faint hum of distant music, her music, drifting across the city she had once feared and now loved completely. Because in the end, her story was not about betrayal or revenge or even triumph. It was about becoming the music itself, boundless, resonant, and forever unfinished. Evelyn Monroe's life had become her final movement, a harmony between silence and sound, between what was lost and what endured. And somewhere, in the heart of the listener, perhaps in you, her melody continues. If her story found its way to you, let it stay. Let it remind you that your own truth has its rhythm, your own heart its song. So listen closely, to the quiet inside you, to the music only you can compose. And when the moment comes, play it.